Got it. Oh, welcome. Well, we're just waiting for people to come in for the next 5 minutes. And if you can just put your mics on mute. Did you see what that? I better put my phone on silent. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're wondering if we could put videos on, just if it's a small group, to see if we can start the conversation together at the end. Oh, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm Devon. Hey. Now, did you guys, you were okay with your Zoom links? Did they work? Yep. Okay, cool. Brilliant.
Oh, good.
I'm not sure where the other people are, but maybe we'll start soon. We'll just do a couple of minutes. If you need to grab a cup of coffee or have a drink. How have you been, Simon? Can I unmute him?
Very well, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, going well. Busy, really busy at McClellan. Just yeah, gearing up now for a lot of shows without restrictions. It's nice to have some certainty around that, and yeah, getting out and about a bit more, which is good. Yeah.
So Simon's a curator at McClellan Gallery. So this is Prudence.
Oh, Prudence. Nice to meet you.
Danielle is our moderator. If you have any links you want to put into the chat of anything you want to share, like those poets or something you we've got a list of things for Prudence's writing as well, and we'll put them in the links so you can look at them during the Q&A or something. But feel free to go off exploring for the links as well. You can turn your video off and
yeah, cool.
Yeah. So it's pretty relaxed. We're just gonna do an introduction to critical plant studies, because a lot of people haven't heard this field, but it's been established for quite a while. And Prudence is the main person in Australia who is doing amazing books about this subject. What do you think? Maybe we should start? Yeah. Hello and welcome to this series of talks in conjunction with my photographic exhibition Survival. This project documents a specific site, Pipe Makers Park, an urban nature reserve left to regenerate and overgrow. Plants coexist and thrive, attracting bird life in this regenerative garden surrounded by housing estates in the western suburbs. Survival is currently showing at Rubicon ARI until the 9th of April. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this forum is being broadcast from Naarm, Melbourne, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Greater Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging that may be listening in. This forum is an introductory discussion on critical plant studies, the entanglements of plant, science, art and philosophy, focusing on the vegetal world. This conversation will draw attention to plant blindness, decentering the human, and the importance of making space for vegetal liveliness. I'd like to introduce Dr. Prudence Gibson to discuss this topic with us today. Hi Prudence, thanks for joining us from Sydney.
Thanks, Sarah.
Dr. Prudence is an academic at the School of Art and Design, University of New South Wales, Sydney. She is lead investigator of an Australian Research Council grant in partnership with Sydney's Royal Botanic Gardens Herbarium. Her recent books are The Plant Contract, Brill 2018, Janet Laurence, The Pharmacy of Plants, NewSouth Books 2015, and her forthcoming book, Dispatches from the Herbarium, will be published with NewSouth Books in February 2023. Hello there, thanks for joining. Is that Sarah from Canada? Yes. Oh, Alexis Williams, sorry.
Hi, yes, I'm here in Canada. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody.
Got in, I'm so excited. Thank you. So I'll be your host today. I'm Sarah Lynch, an artist currently based in Naarm, and I work primarily across digital and analogue photography, video and installation. My most recent work examines the diversity of the botanical world and the relationship between plants, people, and the ecosystems they inhabit. I recently completed my Master of Photography at RMIT in 2020, and in 2021, I completed a residency at Bogon Centre for Sound Culture in between lockdowns. This is the first talk in a two-part series, and there will be another talk on terrain vague, spontaneous plants in the city with ecologist Dean Sheikey on Thursday at 6 p.m. This project has been generously supported by the Victorian Government's Sustaining Creative Workers Initiative in partnership with Creative Victoria and Regional Arts Victoria. Just a quick bit of housekeeping, if you can stay on mute throughout the talk. Any questions throughout the talk, put in the chat box, and there will be time for questions at the end. I hope this forum creates some discussion and invites new perspectives on the visual perception of plants in our environment, and take time to contemplate and take time to look closely at the fragile forms of vegetal life around us. Welcome, Prudence Gibson. I first found out about critical plant studies through your book on Janet Laurence, Pharmacy of Plants, at the Cranbourne Botanical Gardens bookshop. I picked up this book and it sort of changed everything in my art practice. And also in lockdowns, I had to sort of change the way I worked as well. I couldn't suddenly go to Tasmania or exotic locations. I had to start looking in my own backyard. And that's how this project came about. And so I was wondering, Prudence, how you first came to the field of critical plant studies.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to work out when we first met, Sarah, but I think...
Oh, yeah. I didn't get to say that properly. Yeah, Prudence was my external moderator for my master's, and I wrote a little email saying, could you please be a moderator? And from there, it's been fantastic to get to know you and to work with you. And Prudence wrote the catalogue for my show as well. So I feel like we've had a relationship for a while now.
Yeah.
With words and plants. So thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Sarah. I think that this area of critical plant studies is it's massive overseas, especially in Europe. So as I was telling you guys, we just, a colleague and I did a talk at Plymouth University on Wednesday night, which was really,
in the chat. Yeah.
yes, we'll just put that in the chat, the link. But you know, there's just a lot going on and huge networks of people who are interested in critical plant studies. But your question, Sarah, was, well, to answer your first question, in 2014, I met, just by chance, I went to an academic conference in Canberra. It was the Environmental Humanities Conference there. And just by chance, there were two speakers there who changed my life, Sarah, and one of them was Michael Marder. So he had tuned in from Europe, but he was not there in person. And actually I didn't catch his talk, but I went to a talk by a young woman called Monica Gagliano, who is a plant scientist in Australia, who has been enormously influential on me personally and philosophically. And in fact, we're in the process of writing up another big project proposal together about, it's about sonic incubators in plants. And I attended this talk, and Monica was talking about her laboratory work that she'd been doing, where she was basically showing us the evidence for her conclusion, which was based on a hypothesis that she had received this message from plants originally to come up with the hypothesis. So she was plant-induced to do her research, and then as a scientist, she found out this information, basically, that plants not only learn associatively, they remember. And then later she did another sort of laboratory set of experiments, where she worked with, the first time she worked with mimosa, which are plants that have a really sensitive leaf. They curl, retract their leaves as soon as you touch them. Yeah. And so that was the work that she did. She dropped them. And then she noticed that after a certain period of time, they stopped retracting their leaves. And then she noticed that if she came back to them 1 month, 2 months, 3 months later, they had become used to this process of dropping and continued to not retract their leaves. And then the second experiment was with peas, where she had a U kind of system, where she basically was based on the Pavlov dog experiments, where you had the bell and the meat. Yeah. Do you remember that experiment with Pavlov's dog? And so after working with the dog would get saliva just from hearing the bell, because it was associatively learning. And so she did the same thing with peas and worked with light and a fan, which was and so after a certain period of time, you know, obviously plants grow towards light, but because she worked with these pea plants with a fan, or, you know, the movement of air, and they associated that with nourishment because she worked with them, they eventually would grow towards the fan rather than the light. So she kind of was doing this very groundbreaking work, and the atmosphere in the room was really negative towards her. So there were a lot of scientists in the room that were just like, don't like her, I don't like her work, don't like her methodology, don't like her conclusion, don't like her. And I, of course, was like,
were they?
Beg your pardon?
Were they kind of botanists and that sort of people?
To be honest, Sarah, I'm not really sure. It was an environmental humanities conference, but it was really very divisive. There were lots of pro-weed and anti-weed people. There was a lot of tension. And, you know, and I was quite new to all of this. So, you know, I was coming towards the middle of my PhD. I was like, what's everyone getting so worked up about? But anyway, subsequently, got to know her, got to know Michael Marder, published a book with Michael Marder's press, which is Critical Plant plant studies with Brill.
Well,
And Michael Marder is a really important, very French philosopher who, well, he's actually Spanish, but, really sort of grounded in that European tradition of philosophy. So he's coming at critical plant studies, with pure philosophy. I'm coming to it with art and narrative. And so, so I got this Australian Research Council grant, finished my book on Janet Laurence and focused on her plants. And then did the plant contract, which was really about how to better understand what these new sort of discoveries in plant science, what effect that has not only on arts and narratives, so not only on aesthetics, but actually also on more philosophical concepts of, well, what place do humans have anymore if we now need to kind of rethink the independent agency and the vitality of plants themselves. So that's how it all started, whatever it is, nearly 10 years ago. And since then, I've done a lot of work, and I'm writing this new book, which was called Dispatches of the Herbarium, but I'm changing it to the Plant Thieves. But it's that book is really engaging now. Now I need to do a lot more work, which relates to your work, Sarah, which is, I've worked through a lot of discussions, I've done a lot of commentating. I've done a lot of work kind of tracking which artists do what in terms of plant studies and what's effective and what's not. But now that I've been working so closely over the last 2 years with botanists, I am starting to change direction.
Okay. And so the scientists are influencing you to change your perspective, do you think? Or
yes. So, there's more and more information, as you guys would probably know. I mean, there's a really interesting kind of, very accessible information about, for instance, the properties, the capabilities of fungi and how important that fungi are to, communications beneath the soil. There's a lot of, and working with the botanists at the Royal Botanical Gardens has been really influential as well, because it's made me question rather than moving on from the plant science to a degree, Sarah, and starting to think about our very colonial relationships with plants, which is particularly why your work is of interest to me, because working with an institution of plant matter and working with botanists and taxonomists has meant that I've really started to question how we collect plants, how we name plants, what the problems are with access to a collection, what problems there are with, for instance, I'll give you an example. The Royal Botanical Gardens last year, the botanists teamed up with some Aboriginal elders that they knew and they were all talking about this black bean tree. And so the Aboriginal elders that the gardens botanists had contacted very generously shared this story of a songline across the whole arc of top of New South Wales. And they worked together, they teamed up, and basically they went on this big trek, this Indigenous and non-Indigenous team of researchers, and they trekked along the whole songline area that the Indigenous elders had shared and collected specimens of the black bean tree. And when they got back to the laboratory and genetically tested that plant matter, they discovered that all the plant matter that they collected was exactly the same genetic makeup, which supports the Bruce Pascoe kind of modes of thinking, which is that contrary to, I'm 52. So when I was educated, we were given certain pieces of information about Aboriginal culture and lifestyle. And it did not include taking seeds with you, harvesting along the way, so growing crops, harvesting along the way, storing, food, taking food with you and continuing those processes. And so this was, the gardens last year, or I think it was actually the year before, were really exciting about this genetic research discovery and really excited about this collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous scientists. And as I said in the talk the other night, there's a huge problem here that we're all kind of forgetting, which is why do we non-Indigenous people feel like we have to engage in modern science to evidence what Aboriginal people always already knew? What is wrong with us that we don't listen to elders and accept that wisdom and knowledge? And isn't it some sort of insult in a way to celebrate discoveries of plants that perhaps were already known by Indigenous First Nations people around the world, and to celebrate discoveries in genetic plant research when Aboriginal people have been telling us this stuff for 250 years and have known about it for 80,000 years. So even though it is exciting, and I do support the genetic research, and I am thrilled by everything that they're doing, and I also absolutely love, I'm really torn because I absolutely love archives, and I love the aesthetic of the botanical specimen sheets. There is a romantic notion of going out and collecting, but there's a complete absence of collection information about the Indigenous guides, for instance, that took the early colonials out to collect all these hundreds of thousands of specimens. There is no evidence at all in the database.
And they just sort of didn't see that we even had bush foods, or the early kind of, even the botanical gardens, Mueller, I think, introduced blackberries because they thought there was no bush food anywhere. So there was just a complete disregard for what was already here. And you hear about all the colonial, explorers, and then they ignored what they were told, and then they ended up dying because they didn't follow the right processes of processing the plant. There's just a lot of that kind of very tricky area, but it's not recorded in the herbariums, it doesn't seem still.
No, and they're just digitizing the whole collection. So there's 1.4 million specimens they've digitized. So there is another kind of issue, which is around access. So there's the problems of erasure of Indigenous knowledge in the database itself. And of course, I need to qualify that the gardens are very aware of all these issues as well, and are trying to come up with processes and protocols to address them. But it's really difficult because the structure of these institutions is so European. It's actually really difficult to incorporate First Nations knowledge into those systems as they stand, because you've got the Linnaean classification system using the Latin names and the common names, and really you don't really want to change that, because there's an element, or there's a means of sharing with other herbaria all around the world. By using that, if everyone uses that classification system, then it's like using one language. How on earth will anyone know how to share information and to do research together if all of that changes? I mean, apart from it being, and sort of a hugely distributed and vast problem, it's just not. It just doesn't make logical sense. But obviously,
why not be side by side? Like, why can't it be both? Or
yes, exactly. Yeah, and I think it has to be that would have to be Indigenous led. I can't do that work. It needs to be sort of. I don't know what the solution might be, because if it is a new system of classification, for instance, or a new body of, I think there's new language groups in Sydney that have just started up and all around Australia, and I know they're doing a lot of work with animals and places, and some work on plants as well, and trees already. But how do you, is that just going to be always forever distinct from the herbarium and Western botanical knowledge? Or the hard part is not maybe, well, it will be really hard to build that kind of library of names and words, but an even harder part is how do you fit that in to the Western system? Is that even possible?
Is that what you're kind of dissecting in your book? The new?
Yes, I'm definitely dissecting that. Yeah.
Okay.
Struggling with it might be better than dissecting.
Yeah. I was also just wondering to get back to if people don't understand what critical plant studies is, how do you define it, or what, you know, what is it about? Because you talked about agency and vitality, you know, liveliness of plants. How do we kind of see them beyond their use value or their utility for humans?
Yes, exactly. Yes, so critical plant studies is the point at which plant science and the arts meet. So it includes literature, it includes narrative, narrative meaning short storytelling and poetry. It includes art, performance, theatre, and there's just a huge and exciting wealth of work being done. I mean, I even was contacted by someone who is a circus juggler. And wanted to know about what she could glean from critical plant studies in her work, in her practice. So, you know, it's just such a rich and absorbing area, and it also it's more environmental humanities, and for me, and maybe more particularly, it's about botanical aesthetics. But you're right, like basically the maybe I could talk just very briefly about the challenges that many of us struggle with in critical plant studies. One of the main problems is anthropomorphizing the plants. So if we as humans see human-like characteristics in a tree, for instance, then we're more comfortable. When we write about plants and we want to engage with plants in critical plant studies, there's been a lot of work kind of trying to correct a previous error, which is that plants are merely the background to human action or to human activity. And so I think that there's been a lot of writing and artwork where artists and practitioners are trying to engage with plants in a more mutual kin-like way. And the problems or the dangers of that is that we anthropomorphize them, that we just make them, you know, images of ourselves or friends for us to permanently play with. So that, I think that's one, you know, it's a little bit like recolonizing. When we try to solve one problem within plant studies, you know, we have to be conscious of new problems coming up. I think that's one example. The other example is what you were talking about, Sarah, which is the risk of instrumentalizing the plant subject. So just only understanding the plants as they exist for human consumption, for shade, for medicine, for food, or for pleasure. So that brings in the question of aesthetics, you know, cutting flowers, bringing them into the home, that kind of thing. Going to the nursery and buying plants and sticking them in front of you in a pot in front of your house, which are all forms of aestheticizing plants. How can we? And even though, of course, I encourage those relationships very deeply, what do we then do about this problem of instrumentalizing them and just using them and not really fully understanding or respecting their independent agency and inner vitality? And you know, that this, anyway, another problem before I go into maybe a solution is framing this plant subject. So even on the specimen sheet, you know, you've already got it's already a white piece of paper, it's already a frame. You put it in the specimen box, another frame. You hang it in the gallery, it's usually framed or mounted on a frame like canvas or piece of paper. And then of course the white box itself is a frame, etc., etc. The gallery is a frame. So, you know, is this a problem to this issue of framing and flattening the botanical subject? Is it like that deep philosophical question of the minute you approach or try to access another object, it recedes or eludes us? Maybe you guys don't even think this is a problem at all. Like, you know, for me though, these are the key challenges. at play.
Yeah, because I guess what was interesting when I finally did put all my work up in the gallery, the specimens, the singular plants actually took over the space, which was actually really exciting, I think, for me, because I sort of wanted that to occur. But I think colour and, I don't know, there was a lot of colour happening and a lot of things going on, but that's what ended up standing up to most people, which I found really interesting because people were attracted to the singular plant specimens rather than just the landscapes. Or
and I think that's the key to your success, to be honest, Sarah. I think there's two key reasons that your work is so successful in this critical plant studies context. One is your use of colour, because it's so enriched, it's so vital, it's so overwhelming and intense. The colour of the actual photo in the photographs I'm talking about. Firstly,
not just the abstract colours.
I mean, obviously the abstract colours too, but that's the second thing is that you're not trying to pretend that you're not, engaging in the history of abstract painting, and you're not trying to pretend that you're not heroing the plant. There's a complexity to what you're doing, which is, I think maybe the key is that it feels very different. It's not botanical necessarily. It's not necessarily painterly. It's not, and I think what happens is by just having the individual plants, I think maybe that is a way to allow this kind of performative subjectivity of the plants to play out.
Because that was your most recent article, was about performativity of the plants.
Yes, we did a lot of thinking and work for performance philosophy. We edited Professor Katrina Sanderlands from York University in Canada, who is just the most exceptional and rigorous scholar I think I've ever met. Wow. And she's really key figure in critical plant studies, and very modest, and which is also really nice. So she and I edited this journal together, and we really struggled with the issues in critical plant studies and what performance and all kinds of performativity might or might not be able to do in that field. And I'm so glad you've got the fennel up. That's the wild fennel. Yeah, I really like the wild fennel because, this is the other really interesting thing about your work, is that it also very quietly, it's so subtle, your work. It really does grapple with all the key issues in critical plant studies. There's a lot of problematic work, in my opinion, which is, there's a lot of kind of eco-transmission work where people hook a sensor onto a plant and then shove that into their laptop and use their software to emit a sound, and then say, look, this is plant communication. And it's like, no, that's just ventriloquy. That's just pretending that we can hear plants talk. So, I don't have a problem at all with art mediating the relationship between humans and plants, but I just think it has to be thoughtful, and if it can, try and avoid all of these pitfalls, because there are a lot of pitfalls in critical plant studies.
Because we are always putting our take on it, or our, what we want to show, subjective artists sort of thing. But for me, I don't know, when I shot these, because they were natural light, nothing fancy, I didn't really do much to them, in Photoshop or anything. Like, they just sung from their colour and vibrancy, and the forms you start really looking at more closely, I feel, is just what I sort of wanted to portray, I guess. Because I think we just don't look really closely at things. And I guess when you take them out of context, you may notice certain forms differently than when they're out in the park. I mean, it was really interesting. I returned back to Pipe Makers Park where these were shot, and some of the plants were still there that I took the fennel from, like a sprig. I like how you said the sprig of a sticky weed. But it was funny to return and say, oh, that plant's still growing, still doing its thing. And there was all these incredible birds there. And yeah, the place had slightly changed, but when you return to a nature area, it is interesting to see how it persists when you go again and you notice things differently again each time you go back. That's what I liked about this. But yeah, can you explain what plant blindness might be?
Yes, of course.
Term possibly, but
can I just, before I talk about plant blindness, can we linger on your work for a second?
Yeah.
So the sticky weed and the fennel weed, you know, what's so fantastic about artists, and I would include writers because I'm a writer.
Oh, language is so creative, yeah.
No, but in all seriousness, what those of us who have a creative practice do is observe. And, you know, like I was sort of chatting to Brett Summerall, who's the chief scientist at RBG, and he was going out soon, just flying up to Brisbane to do some work in the bush because there's some fungal problem with this area of bush, and they're just going up to look at it, and they just stay in the rangers' cottages along the way, etc. And I was sort of talking to him. I said, "Oh, that sounds amazing." He goes, "Yeah, no, it's really fun. It's fun." But I got this feeling that he's, you know, that he comes at the botanists come at their work slightly differently from practitioners, because, you know, they're very driven by the problem and recording. They definitely observe and record, and then they have to kind of resolve the problem somehow or work towards a resolution. Whereas when I'm spending time in the bush, where I spend a lot of time, and the same with you at the park, we're keenly observing in a completely different way.
To scientists, you think?
Very different. I think it's very different. It's not better or worse. I just think it's, in terms of critical plant studies, in terms that
aesthetically as well, possibly, or the mood, or
maybe spending some useless time, you know, like
think of slowing
time.
down and actually becoming aware of where you are. And I mean, Sarah Gray talks about this a lot through vegetal being, and
oh yeah,
how do you slow down to vegetal time?
Oh yes. Lucy Rigare, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh God, she's fantastic.
Oh, it's amazing. Oh, I've got the book here.
What did you like about that writing, Sarah?
That cultivation of seeking refuge, I suppose, in nature, because I feel like, especially with the pandemic, we've really had to slow down as well as human. Well, I feel like things are revving up again, but there was a time when you know, had to walk around your local area and actually pay attention to what's happening around you. And I guess for me, I kind of liked these unloved plants of weedy kind of spontaneous plants, because we're supposed to culturally dislike them. But how can you dislike this form? Like, for me, I like it. But we're sort of culturally ingrained to dislike these ugly weeds or unsightly weeds, just all this sort of language you have around the other, and it's a whole other conversation, I guess. What's your favorite weedy type species?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh no, I love the lantana, and I've written a couple of papers about the lantana, and been slammed for it. but the thing, I was actually, I love lantana. I love the flowers. I love the it's all along the coast here and all the way up. And there's I was talking to Brett Summerall from the RBG about it, and he was like, he understands why I love it because of the bird life, the insects, the butterflies. So the lantana attracts butterflies. I think there's a lantana garden somewhere in the UK, and it's specifically a butterfly garden.
Really?
Yeah. So it's like, maybe the lantana is okay. But I mean, that's why I love your fennel weed and your sticky weed, because you're also, as you say, you're playing around with an area, a discourse that is extremely fractious. People get very, very uptight about it all, and very polarized by weed or anti-weed. And the whole history of botany in Australia was, because the ships would come down from Portsmouth or Plymouth, come around the Cape and come down to Melbourne, and often these shiploads were funded by wealthy families such as the MacArthurs. So Mount Annan, which is where the new herbarium is being built, they've got all this African olive. It's completely, the whole property is completely overrun with African olive. And the MacArthurs brought out the African olive they stopped off on their trip and thought, this will be a good anti-erosion shrub. So sort of the best intentions actually of some of these early white settlers, to be very generous. And there was a beach daisy that was brought from South Africa, which I interviewed this amazing woman called Claire Brandenberger, who works at the gardens, and she's done her PhD on this particular South African beach daisy that they wanted to help secure the dunes up and down the coast. But what's happened is that even over the last 100 years, this little daisy has changed its morphology, its flowers, its leaves.
Oh, this is the South African one.
Yes, even its reproduction is different. So it now has to be completely reclassified. So that's an example of fast evolution.
Well, that's what I've tried to speak to Angela Moles, but she was very busy. But she's the head of doing that.
Oh, okay.
But next week we're doing a whole other talk on urban ecology and spontaneous plants. So please come to that too.
Fantastic.
So that's going to be very interesting, because that will be complete focus on the weedy species that we have in Australia, in cities. Yep. But if anyone wants to put in the chat also what's their favourite weed or favourite spontaneous plant, like I like to say now. It's sort of a much nicer term. I don't know what people think of spontaneous plants. But yeah, thank you so much. This is amazing. We didn't really get to talk about plant blindness, but
do you want me to very quickly explain that?
We want to open up the floor too and see if anyone has any questions, and you can also type any questions you want into the chat, or we'll open it up and you can turn your mics off or turn them on and ask Prudence or I a question. But please, just quickly say what plant blindness might be.
So plant blindness is literally, there was a lot of work done, I think in the 60s, and then there was an Italian plant scientist who did some work with basically how we analyze images. And so children were shown images of like a lion in the jungle, or a bear in the forest, etc., and hold them up, and everyone, not just children, but everyone would say lion, bear, snake, monkey. No one ever said whatever type, acacia tree or snake vine, or no one ever acknowledged what is usually 80% of any given image. So that's pretty much what plant blindness is, just in a very quick summary. But as you can imagine, the ramifications of that for how we don't even understand, we don't even acknowledge, let alone truly understand the independent vitality of plants.
because you talked about how animals, we can identify with them because they have eyes, and plants don't have that views, eyes that we can identify with. We're very different species, but the amount that they do to create this world and the air that we breathe, but we just don't even think about them and what they do. Yeah. But there is a good article on that, I think, on the conversation about the plant. I thought it was by you, but it was actually someone else who wrote it.
Yes, I have read that one. And actually, Giovanni Alloy has just done a paper on plant blindness. There's a second part to that link, which I'll do whilst you guys are all chatting. But he does talk a tiny bit about plant blindness. And actually, I've got a paper in performance research coming out in April, which is about plant blindness as well.
Really?
But
you've got so many articles. How do you do it?
I have to. If I don't, I'll lose my job.
You have to have points. But also, because you do collaborate with people constantly too. How does that work?
I love it. I love it. Now I have, except for my book, the book that I'm writing, which I'm kind of glad it's over because the
dirt witches you have to mention as well.
Oh, the dirt witches, yes. Oh, it's really exciting news. I don't think it's been announced, but there's 6 of us. Well, there's 60 of us actually in this group, the dirt witches. But a smaller subgroup of us built an Eastern Suburbs Banksia scrub in the CBD in Sydney. And the council has just, our wonderful Lord Mayor Clover Moore, she's a legend. She so it was part of this Laneways art project, and there was 6, and they extended our forest for 6 months, and now they've just decided, they haven't announced it, but it's going to be permanent, which is really expensive for them because they're going to have to dig down underneath the road and do all sorts of stuff. So
that's so good.
Yeah,
and that was just like an art grant or something that you applied for, or like.
So that was the City of Sydney had this art laneways project. So they gave us, and we were successful. So they gave us 50 grand to build it. And we had to keep back 15 grand to deinstall it. I don't know what we're doing with that 15 grand, but someone has it.
Well, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic to talk about this. I mean, the thing with plant blindness, I did want it with my work. Danny, can you just put up with the colour field? I guess my intention with the colour fields was to people to do a double take of the landscape to try and see if you see into it more. Or do you think this is successful doing that, Prudence?
I 100% think it is. I was asked the other night, because I gave this talk about what I think is successful, and someone in the chat said which artists are successful, and I didn't have time to respond because it finished, but your work is 100% addressing all of these issues, and there's something about that, this does to my eye, which just makes me there's something so familiar about the colors on the right that we all understand, and there's something about the really beautiful, intense color of your photographs. I don't know what it does. I mean, it's just magic. It's sorcery at work, but it definitely draws attention back to the bush. And I'm sure I would love to know what everyone else thinks, but it does feel like a little bit of witchcraft and sorcery at work here. I just think it's an enlightened way to approach all of these problems, because it's just really clear, and it exactly, look at that one. So when I was first looking at your work, I was trying to use the color field paint to inform what I was seeing. And then, but if you actually stop doing that a little bit, like turning off the intellect for a second and just let it happen, your eyes drift back to the bush and go more deeply into it. I don't know what everyone else thinks.
Back and forth. Yeah, that's sort of the intention, I think. And you haven't got to even see them in, person.
I know. I can't wait. I can't wait to get that opportunity.
Yeah, is there one more? Or yeah, anyway, we better open up the floor to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's so good to see you all. This is my first series I've done, so thank you for being a very understanding audience. It's been really fun. But we'd love to hear your thoughts if you have any questions for Prudence.
Or for Sarah.
Or for me.
Thanks for organising, Sarah, and congratulations on the exhibition. It's really fantastic.
Thanks.
And thanks, Prudence. It's really great to hear a bit more about critical plant studies, something that's fairly new to me, even though I'm kind of been involved a lot at working at McClelland with, relatively natural bushland and the context of art and the environment and how they interlink, and representations of nature, which are highly problematic in every sense, philosophical, artistic, and even social. So really fascinating to hear more.
But you did that fantastic show last year with sound, and
we did a show, sonic art as as ecological practice, looking at how
really
sound in the environment can give, if we focus on just the oral cues in the environment, we can understand a lot more about ecology that we're within. So it was pretty broad ranging. There was everything from kind of, I guess, highly scientific art practices using hydrophones in Antarctica and that kind of thing, that would track various ecosystem changes, to really quite simple participatory artworks where you would just go on a sound walk through the bush and just attune to different sounds.
Wow, sounds amazing.
Fantastic. And Madeline, who I'm co-curating a show end of next year, she was in that show, and where I did my residency, Philip Samartzis was in it as well. And I think Madeline was commissioned to do a residency there, and she took into account the McClelland nature, which was amazing, that show.
Yeah, a project called Borderlands, where she looked at basically, the intersections between the relatively natural, say in inverted commas, bushland of McClelland and the adjoining residential and industrial kind of areas, which was quite interesting, and the kind of bleed between those two or three areas.
Because you were saying you were looking at Russian poets.
Yeah, it's been
they're talking about nature and
strangely kind of similar to you, Sarah, with the lockdowns and staying at home, vegetating, I guess you could say. I've just kind of been spending more time in the garden and getting into that plant time, I guess. And kind of at the same time starting to read a lot of, just kind of found my way to a lot of Russian poetry from the 1920s and 30s, and a group of poets that are really fascinating in terms of ecological thinking and artistic representations through poetry of ecology, and all kind of set against the background of I should send a link.
Send that link. I think you sent one.
But they're kind of just following the Russian Revolution and the whole instrumentalization of nature through agriculture that the Soviets kind of mobilized around that time, which was pretty full on and far reaching. And a lot of these poets seem to react against that by I guess cultivating a kind of, it's kind of a pantheistic philosophy, I guess, thinking about how humans are interconnected with the environment and nature. Let me just get this link. Actually, there's one poem that really kind of sums it up nicely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, but a really fascinating group of poets who kind of seem to preempt a lot of these problems around thinking, how do you think about plants which actually operate on a completely different consciousness? Where are we?
While you're doing that, can I just ask Alexis, could you put a link to the biophilian group? Can we unmute? Let's hey.
I didn't hear what you said. It was sort of breaking up.
Sorry, can you put a link to the Ayatana biophilian? Because
I'd love to.
In Canada. Thank you so much for joining us. What time is it there?
Oh, it's 9 o'clock. It's not that late. I'm just quite comfortable.
You look very comfortable.
Yeah. Do you want me to tell you guys what this is?
Yeah, I did an art and botany course with you last week, and it was very inspiring.
It was really fun. I run a program. It's an artist residency program, and it used to be an adventure for artists all around the world to come to Canada and spend a week geeking out about something that was usually to do with wildlife and ecology. And we did a program on the biophony, on the sounds of wildlife, and we did a program on plants, and we did all these different programs. But now we do them online, and I really like how it works online because we spend 2 weeks together doing talks like this with scientists and research labs all around the world. So so we get to, I don't know, we get to dig in a little bit further, and it means that we're not limited to only the scientists in Ottawa. And I love the scientists in Ottawa, but I've been hanging out with them for like 10 years, and now if I can imagine it, like if I can find a word to describe it and I can Google it, I can find a scientist studying it. And they're usually excited about talking to a bunch of artists who are really interested in what they're doing. So yeah, it's just a super dorky project, but it's really quite a lot of fun.
Oh.
I also put a link a little further up, or maybe just the one before, that's it's a field guide that hasn't been published yet, but it's being made. But it's a field guide to the ecology, I think, in kind of the like sort of Western United States, but it's classified with indigenous ecological classification. So instead of classifying like all the plants that are related to each other genetically, it puts together all the plants that are related to each other ecologically. So the things that are interacting with the same kinds of organisms. So it uses kinship, I think, is how you described it, rather than genetics.
That's a really good thing. Thank you. I think Prudence might like that.
I can't wait for it to exist. I want to hold it in my hand and read it.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm just wondering whether, I'm not sure if it'll just cut out on us at 12 o'clock, but I just want to just say thank you so much for all coming, and it's been very inspiring to have Prudence come and talk about, because it's closely relates to my work, and she's an incredible writer, so I really recommend you have a look at her work, if you could have a look at her links. Yeah, and come and see my show in Melbourne. And thank you,
Congratulations, Sarah.
Oh, thanks. Devin, how did you hear about the show or this talk?
So hilariously, I just finished up working at a circus. So interesting that you brought that up. So I have a performance practice, and I've just finished up, and it popped up on my social feed, Sarah, and it's sort of where my brain, I've sort of had 3 weeks of no working and just trying to sort of settle into some curiosity spaces for myself. And certainly much like you and Simon have both talked about, like been reading a lot over the last couple of years, and there's been a lot of thematics that of books that have really sort of sparked my curiosity. And I was interested in what critical plant studies was like. You know, it's always interesting when you're like, oh, there's a word for the thing that interests me.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it as well, because that became my whole master's research. And
yeah, so exciting to have discovered this. And then I would also just add, Alexis, I grew up in Chelsea, Quebec. I went to Chelsea primary school and lived in Wakefield until I was 17.
Amazing. So, that's where the residency was. Yeah.
I just had a little peek while we were looking, and I was like, what? That's hilarious. So
amazing. Hello, nice to meet you.
I'll be there in July, hopefully. So
Evan, you're in Australia at the moment?
I am. I'm up in Anjara country in near Dalesford, Hepburn Springs area. So I live on country and I steward land up here. So there's sort of just a daily practice element that I'm interested in as well.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Hilarious.
Yeah. Is there any other questions that anyone wants to ask Prudence or me? Or should we just leave it at that? Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And you're all very fantastic people, and I love plant people. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Prudence. This was lovely. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Oh, yeah. And because you hadn't heard of critical plant studies, even though, but I think you do know about it, but maybe just not the term. Or
do you mean me?
Oh, I think, well, I remember saying, what? And you were like, what is critical plant studies or spontaneous plants? And anyway, it was just really cool to be able to share. You guys have a book club of all the books, and you said you just read Thus Spoke the Plant by Monica Liano.
Yeah, I did do. And yeah, and it's so exciting. And I knew about so many of the experiments that she did, but I didn't know that they were all made by the same person. So it was really exciting to hear her describe, you know, how she got to these experiments. Yeah, absolutely. Aetana, well, the Biophilium often talks to plant neurobiologists and people who are studying plant intelligence. So they reference her work all the time. So yeah, it's so cool that you know these people.
Yeah, that's so cool. All right. Well, yeah, thank you again. And thank you, Daniela. She's been moderating the chat. She can't speak because our mics go weird when she puts her mic on. Thanks for joining us today. And yeah, thank you again. And we'll see you in the future.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Another talk next Thursday, yeah, on spontaneous plants in the city.
Great. Bye, guys.
Thanks so much. See you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.